Neurotic Literature by James Lark. This story: The Boy Who Read Books Meant for Girls. The publishers should have made it clearer. Probably they would argue that it was an issue of branding, that any prolific and best-selling author of children's books is marketed with a certain consistency as a matter of course. If you're apportioning blame, the publishers would say, blame the publicists. Blame the people who advise that an author's book covers have the same design, use an easily recognised font and feature artwork by the same hand. This, publicists insist, ensures that said books will find their intended audience and will, figuratively speaking, fly off the shelves. All of which was certainly true for the work of Mary MacLane, veteran writer for the juvenile market, whose volumes, new and old, did indeed fly off shelves, as they had been doing for well over a decade. But what wasn't clear, at least not to anyone judging said volumes by their identically branded covers, was that their intended audience was a rather diverse one, insofar as the children for whom she wrote ranged from a generic pre-teen demographic to one that was specifically female and approaching adulthood. Due to Mary MacLane's ubiquity in the world of juvenile fiction, this was not exactly a secret. Perhaps her publishers, and indeed publicists, felt that reputation alone would allow readers to differentiate the wholesome and mildly comical books aimed at a younger audience from the more indecorous content of the others. Or perhaps they felt that potential readers would look beyond the colourful hand-drawn covers and familiar title font and read the blurb helpfully provided on the back page. Neither of these assumptions held true for the parents of Timothy Jenkins. Timothy was an ordinary, if shy, 11-year-old boy, with a reading age that was slightly above average and an approach to work that his teachers had described, with differing degrees of approval or scorn, as creative. One of those teachers had, when Timothy was about 8 years old, read the first book in Mary MacLane's popular Treacle series to his class. Treacle was a Yorkshire Terrier, whose hilarious antics were a constant and entertaining source of trouble for Hal, Sandra, Lucy, Steve and Davy Hatton, the average middle-class family who owned him. The stories of Treacle's antics resonated with many a dog owner, as the dog-owning children in Timothy's class were apt to loudly observe. Timothy did not have a dog because he was not allowed one, though he did so want one, and had begged his parents to get one until his dad had told him to stop crying because under no circumstances, none at all, are we ever getting a dog. So for Timothy, the Treacle book was an endearing, amusing window into a world that he had been denied. It wasn't the same as having a dog, but it was the next best thing. Besides which, Mary MacLane wrote appealing and realistic characters, famously so. By the time Timothy's teacher reached the end of the book, he felt as though he knew the Hatton family personally and was eager to spend more time in their company. Being the sort of boy that Timothy was, that weekend he dragged his mother to the library to borrow the next book in the series. He read it in a couple of days, then his mother read it and was also suitably entertained. Before long he had borrowed the whole series, and when it came to birthday and Christmas presents over the next few years, Mary MacLane's Treacle books were an obvious choice. By the time it came to Timothy's 11th birthday, he had the whole series on his shelf, including Treacle and the Magic Money Tree, which excitingly had been published only a year previously. So his parents, naturally enough, looked a little further along the row of books by Mary MacLane. After all, her Treacle books had proved a huge hit with their son. Why not one of the others? They settled upon one called Juniper. There was little on the cover to disclose the precise subject matter, but the average middle-class girl on the cover would have fit in perfectly with the Hatton family. The titular Juniper was probably, they imagined, another mischievous dog, or a cat, maybe even a guinea pig. they imagined wrong. Juniper was a 15-year-old girl, with quite a different set of dilemmas to those which preoccupied Treacle's owners. Oh, the Hattons had to deal with spilled coffee and mysteriously opened Christmas presents and toilet rolls turning up in embarrassing places. But they had never shown any awareness of the things that kept Juniper on her toes. Awkward crushes, surprising physiological developments, distressing bodily functions. Tonally, also, there was a startling difference of style. Whereas the trials of the Hatton family were always played for laughs, Juniper's adventures were portrayed as deeply traumatic, even though a younger reader would probably not quite understand why. Charlie Chaplin said that comedy is a long shot and tragedy a close-up. But as far as Mary MacLane seemed to be concerned, comedy was a Yorkshire Terrier, whilst tragedy was a young woman. Even so, Timothy did not know that it was a book intended for girls. Nor did he realise it when he started reading, for all that it became immediately clear that this was a rather different kind of work to the ones he had so enjoyed previously. There were sections which certainly intrigued and, in a few cases, confused him. A paragraph dealing with acts of self-gratification was so specific to the experiences of young women that it could hardly make sense to a pre-adolescent boy, whose own explorations into the male equivalent had thus far been fairly tentative. A chapter on breasts was fortunately less cryptic, thanks to an educational film he had been shown at school earlier in the year. He approached the other mysteries in the book with variable understanding, but in any case, Mary MacLane was not a revered children's author for no reason, and the narrative and characterisation were enough to entice him into the world of Juniper every bit as much as he had been drawn into the Hatton household. It wasn't his fault. If nobody explains to you that content is intended only for a teenage, female audience, a juvenile reader will assume that it is all part of the rich pageant of literature, a glass held up to the lives of others in the way that is a feature of all fiction. And because he had found the book as riveting as anything in the Treacle series, he read it from cover to cover without once realising that he should never have had it in the first place. His curiosity fully awakened by Juniper's problems, and his eyes opened to the fact that Mary MacLane's back catalogue was considerably broader than he had previously imagined. He subsequently searched the shelves at both his local and school libraries for more. Which is how he came to read a great number of her books, such as Elizabeth J., Plenty More Fish in the Sea, Gabby's Summer House, and Autumn Crush, in complete ignorance that this writing was not for 11-year-olds and not for boys, that it was girl fiction, written for girls and about girls, its concerns entirely the concerns of girls, that they were, in short, books meant for girls. He might have remained ignorant of this, but for the intervention of his teacher, Miss Forster, who spotted him during a silent reading period as he was nearing the end of What's Up with Rachel, a battered copy of which he had discovered pushed towards the back of one of the bookcases in his classroom. Miss Forster was too sensible a teacher to humiliate him by pointing out his transgression in front of the whole class. But the next day she discreetly asked Timothy to stay behind during morning break so that she could have a word with him. "I noticed that you were reading this book yesterday, Timothy," she said, pulling What's Up with Rachel from her desk drawer. She had discovered the copy at the back of the bookshelf, guiltily snuck there, she imagined, to cover up his illicit literary explorations, though in fact he had simply put it back where he found it. She held the offending article between two fingers, radiating the same air of distaste as she would holding up an untidy worksheet or a crisp packet littering the floor. Timothy felt his stomach lurch. It was abundantly clear that he had done something wrong, though he couldn't think what it might be. Was that bookshelf off limits for some reason? Surely not. Everybody used it. Did the book belong to another pupil? Had he unknowingly taken somebody else's property? "I put it back," he gulped. "Even so," she pressed, "you read it first, did you not?" His whole body had tensed, instinct telling him that whatever misdemeanour he had committed was a deeply shameful one. Words catching in his throat, he could respond with nothing more than a nod. "I did not catch that, Timothy." "Yes," he gasped. "You read all of it?" "Y- but only once," he stuttered, his breaths short and anxious. Miss Forster smiled. This was easier than she had expected. But then, she was a teacher of nearly 3 decades' experience. She took justifiable pride in her psychological intuition when it came to children, specifically when discipline was concerned. Timothy's initial confession having been so easily won, perhaps it was not going to be so difficult after all to get him to own up to the rest. Because there was more to settle yet. With characteristic thoroughness, Miss Forster had made an investigation of the class copy of What's Up with Rachel and had discovered, with a weary sense of disappointment but no particular surprise, that it fell open at particular pages. A cursory glance at those pages clearly explained why. "You read bits of it more than once, I think," she said to Timothy, smiling to demonstrate that he was in a safe space, but keeping her steely eyes on him to make sure that he didn't mistakenly sense any chance of escape. "Didn't you?" Timothy thought back. Yes, he had read bits of it more than once. There had been descriptions of matters about which, in spite of his growing familiarity with Mary MacLane's oeuvre, he knew nothing at all, and he had gone over them again in the hope of gaining some clarity. Was this what the conversation was about? Did Miss Forster think he was out of his depth? Blushing to his roots, he nodded again. "Sorry, Timothy?" "Yes," he said, miserably. "Would you like to explain to me," Miss Forster gently invited him, "why?" Those bits, they didn't all make sense at the time." Miss Forster, saddened by the predictably evasive response, fixed him with a set expression. The atmosphere in the room thickened. She decided that the time had come to use sarcasm. "I can see that you had to immerse yourself in those sections," she quietly told him, "many times over." "I understood most of it after the second or third time," he quickly blurted, his voice coming out at an absurdly high pitch as he naively tried to reassure her that there wasn't a problem with his reading ability. "I have no doubt," she responded dryly. "Perhaps you would like to explain those bits to me?" She stared at him, frowning with an expression of mock curiosity. Timothy swallowed. He tried to think back over the story he had read only the other day, but confronted with the question, his mind had gone blank. After a desperate pause, he shook his head, defeated. She let What's Up with Rachel fall open and glanced at the page in front of her grimly. "Perhaps you can tell me what you understand about heavy petting." Timothy opened his mouth, his mind desperately racing over the thoughts that had occurred to him the other day. His first supposition had been that it was to do with keeping large animals, but he recalled that this hadn't made sense, so he had formed some other theories. He couldn't remember what those were, and, deprived of its context, the phrase made even less sense. He closed his mouth and shook his head. Miss Forster flicked forward a few pages. "Well, how about explaining this reference to screwing?" she suggested. Again, Timothy's mouth opened, a Pavlovian response from a boy who was generally one of the first to offer answers, but this time he was absolutely certain that all of his guesswork about carpentry had been off the mark. Miss Forster flicked further forward. "Or here," she said, a note of sternness entering her voice. "Look, a whole paragraph about bra sizes. I feel sure you can explain what you have learned about those." Timothy blushed again, wishing the floor could swallow him up. That was just embarrassing. "No?" asked Miss Forster expectantly. Finally she sighed and snapped the book shut. She hadn't expected an answer. Essentially, she had already extracted all of the information that she wanted. But there was something dissatisfying about the situation. He had admitted to reading the book and was clearly mortified about the whole thing, but as yet he had not vocalised any sense of shame. And as his teacher, it was her duty to ensure that he did just that. "Why did you choose this book, Timothy?" she probed. "I like Mary MacLane," Timothy quietly explained. Miss Forster frowned, suddenly unnerved by his frankness. Everyone knew what Mary MacLane wrote about, but here he was, as bold as brass, telling her that he liked it. She had come across such audacity in her previous job at an all-girls secondary school. This was where she had first become aware of the genre that Mary MacLane's alleged literature fell into. But she had never expected to encounter such brazenness from an 11-year-old boy. "Which books in particular, Timothy?" "Treacle," he mumbled. He couldn't meet her eyes, still vaguely traumatised by the fact that she had asked him about bra sizes. "I beg your pardon?" "The Treacle series," he clarified, raising his trembling voice a little. Miss Forster could well imagine the kind of adolescent harlot that this Treacle must be, and didn't doubt the prurient encounters that must feature in a whole series of books. "Go on," she coldly instructed. Perhaps he should have explained about bra sizes? Uncomfortable though that would have been in front of a teacher, in front of anyone, it was actually a topic covered with frank clarity by MacLane's books, and Timothy's comprehension had reached an unusually advanced level for a boy his age. He was not oblivious to the cloud of disapproval that surrounded the interrogation. Convinced that it was an exercise in comprehension that he had thus far been failing, he knew that his only hope was to demonstrate that he was not out of his depth. Emboldened by the fear that he might be moved onto the facile, graded books that the less fluent readers in his class were prescribed, an answer of sorts started to spill out of his mouth in a disorganised muddle. "I really enjoyed Gabby's summer house, which I thought was evocative and tantalising," he said, dredging up a few of the adjectives they had been told to use in book reviews. "I read Elizabeth J., which was very interesting, and what was the word that was like exciting, but better than that, like a really thrilling expression of excitement?" "Explicit?" suggested Miss Forster. "Yes," he agreed gratefully. That hadn't been the word he was after, but it would do just as well. "I thought the interaction between the characters was especially stimulating." As Timothy spoke, Miss Forster's frown deepened. Again, it was the cocksure impertinence of it all. "Do you think these books are suitable choices?" she interrupted. Timothy sensed that she remained less than convinced. "I like it," he told her breathlessly. "Like what?" Miss Forster pressed. Timothy shrank back into his chair, humiliated and ashamed, but still desperate to persuade his teacher that he could cope with challenging reading material. "I enjoy reading when it gets hard." Miss Forster let out a disgusted squeal, discovering that for the first time in nearly 3 decades of teaching, she had no idea how to react. Timothy's parents were summoned for an urgent meeting. She sat them down in her classroom after school, while Timothy was sent to wait in the music room, and he spent 15 minutes forlornly playing a xylophone. Miss Forster didn't sugarcoat the facts. "Timothy has been reading books meant for girls." They stared at her in disbelief. Lynette Jenkins opened her mouth to issue an instant denial, then paused. Miss Forster was extremely intimidating, especially sitting as she was behind her desk looking all authoritative, and Lynette couldn't be absolutely certain of her facts. Timothy was always reading, after all, so might it be possible that he was reading books for girls? But he was quite open about the reading he did at home, whether in the lounge or at bedtime, and she was sure she would have noticed. What were these books meant for girls, anyway? She drew breath to ask, only to be interrupted by her husband. "So where's he been getting them?" Gary Jenkins had been forced to leave the office early to attend this meeting, which would likely mean making the time up on Friday. This had put him into a bitter mood before the conversation had even started, and the teacher's opening gambit had tapped into an existing concern. Gary was a good father and loved his son regardless, obviously, of the boy's character or peculiarities, of which there were several. Fathers tolerate such things as a matter of course, and there was no doubting that Gary was devoted to Tim. Always had been. That said, he felt a twinge of disappointment that Tim had so little interest in the things that meant so much to him. Formula One racing, or kicking a ball around in the garden. Tim was, he couldn't deny, more of an indoor sort of boy. A boy who liked listening to music, cooking, and reading, who had once joined the school knitting club, which Gary had privately felt neither the school nor they as parents should have encouraged, but it had made Lynette happy, and sometimes it was worth letting a principle slide for the sake of a contented wife. Even so, Tim was not the sort of boy Gary had been. Which was not a problem, obviously, but was mildly perplexing all the same. How had the kid turned out so different? Gary had made sure to buy him toy cars, footballs, plastic guns and swords, the usual boy games. So how was it that Tim had turned into an 11-year-old who preferred to spend an afternoon doing origami, who'd choose a jigsaw puzzle over running around with a toy gun, or who, when they did go on outings, would turn his nose up at a theme park but request to visit a wildfowl sanctuary? Miss Forster was finally offering an explanation. And if there was an explanation, Gary thought grimly, then by extension someone was to blame. "These books meant for girls," he said, unable to conceal the fury in his voice. "Who gave them to him?" "He got one of them from over there," said Miss Forster, pointing at the shelf where she had recovered the hidden copy of What's Up with Rachel. "He borrowed it, barefaced as you like." Gary craned his neck round. "It was on that shelf there." "As I just told you. Middle of the day, in front of everyone. He did not even seem to mind if anyone saw." "You had a book meant for girls on that shelf?" asked Gary, his voice shaking. "Left there, a height any child could reach, not even locked away or anything?" "That is correct." "You have books meant for girls just sitting there?" said Gary, with rising ferocity. "Yes, we have books meant for girls in this school," Miss Forster patiently explained, though she allowed her volume to match his because she sensed that this ignorant parent was implying some kind of criticism, and frankly, it should have been the other way round. "Because we have girls in this school. Are those books separated from the others?" Gary demanded, his eyes burning. "Are they labelled differently?" "There is no need to do that," Miss Forster frostily informed him, "because it is perfectly obvious that they are books for girls." "Obvious to you, perhaps," snorted Gary. "These days you shouldn't assume, should you? With all this gender fluidity and, women's football and so on, you have to spell it out." "If Timothy did not know it was intended for girls," Miss Forster slowly replied, a deadly smile on her face, "then why did I catch him hiding it?" She hadn't actually caught him hiding the book, but she knew that he had, and that was the point that needed to be made. "Is Timothy ordinarily in the habit of hiding books?" It was enough to shut Gary up for a moment. Lynette took the opportunity to interject. Which books exactly are you talking about?" "Books by Mary MacLane," Miss Forster answered, delivering each syllable with clinical precision. "Oh, but—" Lynette started to panic, recalling the long list of Mary MacLane books she had bought her son. "Mary MacLane doesn't write books for girls. She writes children's books, lovely stories." Gary was lost in his own thoughts and about to come back at Miss Forster over how negligent she was to leave these books lying about where absolutely anybody could pick them up, and of course Tim was bound to be curious even if he did know they weren't for him, when he realised that his wife was tapping him on the knee urgently. "Aren't they, Gary? I mean, we've been buying them for Timothy for years, haven't we?" "Would you say this is for children?" asked Miss Forster, pushing What's Up with Rachel across her desk with dreadful gravity. She had left it on a page to which it was already inclined to fall open. Gary and Lynette read in awkward silence. The words in front of Lynette started to blur, and she wondered if she might be about to cry. Cry in front of a teacher! She couldn't. That was so embarrassing. That hadn't happened since she was at school. But it was all too much. Was this what they had been buying Timothy all these years? She had read some of them, surely, even aloud to Timothy as bedtime stories. She couldn't remember anything like this. Confronted with the prose in front of her, not exactly obscene, but clearly unsuitable for an 11-year-old boy, she began to doubt everything. "You have been buying these books for Timothy?" asked Miss Forster with performative disbelief, secretly delighted to have been able to turn the tables on them so easily. But then she was a teacher of nearly 3 decades' experience. "Surely you realise that they are aimed at a teenaged female audience." Gary picked up the book and irately leafed through it, then turned it over in his hands, inspecting the front and back covers. It did look a bit girly, but... Well, there's nothing on here that specifically says it's for girls, is there? I think it is fairly discernible. Not if people go about putting it on ordinary shelves where anybody can get hold of it. He jabbed a finger in the direction of Miss Forster's bookshelf. And for that matter, I don't think we've ever got one of these off a girl shelf in the shops. No, agreed Lynette tearfully. The Mary MacLane books are always in the children's fiction. There are no warnings or anything. In which case, continued Gary, almost incandescent, I'd say it's your fault, and the fault of the shops, and frankly the fault of the publishers, that kids like Tim get hold of this girly crap. Furthermore, he leaned forward and banged his fist on Miss Forster's desk, I'd say that's where legal responsibility lies for the damage that has been done. All right, Mr. Jenkins, do calm down, said Miss Forster, smiling beneficently because she knew exactly how to deal with children, even ones like the blustering man-child confronting her. Nobody here is talking about damage. The reason I felt I needed to speak to you was to intervene before any lasting harm is done. My point is, Gary continued, red-faced and determined, if lasting harm has been done, anyone talking to Timothy can see that there is no question of lasting harm. She reassured him with complete insincerity. She still shivered inwardly when she recalled the creepy conviction of the little pervert. We just need to take steps to make sure that this does not continue. Steps. Right. Gary nodded and folded his arms, suddenly in agreement. Lynette wiped her eyes and sniffed. I will take on board your suggestions as regards the displaying of such books in the school. Right, exactly. And what's more, and, continued Miss Forster, I am sure that you will both reflect on the choices you make as parents when buying literature for your child. She allowed her smile to broaden as she met the twin gaze of the couple, enjoying the way that Mr. Jenkins's mouth continued to flap up and down even though his momentum and ability to speak had been robbed from him. Gary was quiet as they walked back to the car. And to think that we were buying him these books all along, Lynette was jabbering, horribly shaken by the whole experience. I mean, he's been reading them right in front of us. Surely he never realised that there was anything wrong with it. Can't undo it now, can we? Said Gary desolately. We'll take the books off him and that's that. No point blaming ourselves. But it was our fault, wasn't it? Lynette asked anxiously. No, definitely not, no, said Gary. He would be watching Tim extremely closely, forensically, because if damage had been done, somebody would be held to account. After all, how many other parents might have made the same mistake, might be making it right at that moment? In the meantime, he would need to take evasive measures. Get Mary MacLane and everything of her ilk off Tim's shelves, for sure, and there would be other things he could do to counter the influence of those damn books, even if it meant dragging his son to a football field. Evasive measures, he said. We need to take evasive measures. They removed the Mary MacLane books from Timothy's room. Gary went through the other paperbacks, pulling out anything that looked at all suspect. Some of the larger volumes went too. A couple of cookery books, a knitting annual which Timothy's grandparents had stupidly bought him. There were also posters of musicians and, Whether they were girls or boys, frankly, Gary couldn't always be sure. It seemed too risky to leave them up. The wall chart on which Timothy had been marking stately homes he had visited came down for good measure. Those stately homes were full of dresses and jewellery, weren't they? It was asking for trouble. Since all of this happened completely out of the blue and without cause, except perhaps as a result of a shortcoming in reading comprehension, the nature of which Timothy was still only able to conjecture, and since he was an avid reader and one of his happiest places was to disappear into any one of Treacle's adventures, Timothy was naturally distraught. "Stop crying, you're not a girl," Gary bluntly ordered. But being a good father, Gary had anticipated his son's distress. And it wasn't Tim's fault that the bookshelf had ended up full of feminine prose, so Gary made sure to replace the impounded items. He donated some Formula One posters of his own for the walls, put some hardbacks about car manufacture and sporting achievements where the cookery and knitting had been, and most generously of all, he went out and bought a brand new set of novels with which to replace the unsuitable ones. He initially gravitated towards a series about footballers, but realised that however colourful the adventures inside, they were not going to appeal to his son's idiosyncrasies, so instead opted for a vivid series of science fiction books. The covers depicted appropriately virile scenes of broad-shouldered space soldiers wielding futuristic weaponry and doing battle with robot machines, alien creatures and other menaces. Gary wasn't much of a reader himself and didn't research the content too closely, but he was reassured by the general absence of girls from the line drawings that accompanied chapter headings. Where women did feature, they were usually cowering in the shadow of a heroic spaceman offering protection with his weapon. There was little danger, Gary felt, of even Tim perceiving them as identification figures. "I don't want these," wept Timothy ungratefully. "I'm not interested in this genre." "You will be," Gary promised. "I want my old books back." "It's not about what you want, it's about what's best for you. If you carry on being this version of yourself, God only knows where it's going to end. You're not a little kid anymore, and this is what boys your age read. Look, robots." He left his snivelling child to acquaint himself with the genre more fully, confident that Tim would soon be converted by the thrills of macho space escapades. 30 minutes later, Timothy emerged, holding one of the new books. "Enjoying it?" Gary brightly inquired, looking up from his Formula One magazine. Timothy put it on the coffee table. "I can't have this in my room," he stubbornly announced. "Why not?" "I don't like the picture on the cover." Gary picked it up and studied the illustration. What the hell was wrong with the picture? This one even had a woman on it, which ought to have been up Tim's street if the old books were anything to go by. Literally, the only difference was that this one was wearing a space bikini and clinging to the arm of a muscled cadet brandishing a laser cannon. He shrugged. "Looks fine to me." "It objectifies women." "No, it doesn't. You're just being difficult because you're in a sulk." "Yes, it does," Timothy obstinately insisted. "It is a stereotypical image of male gratification." "That is a perfectly accurate picture of a woman," Gary impatiently informed his son. "No, don't argue. I've got loads more experience than you on the matter, so you'd best keep your prissy opinion to yourself." "You can't even see her face hidden behind that big gun thing." Gary lost his temper. "It's a laser cannon," he shouted, "and I don't see why you need to see her face, not when she's got plenty more to look at." "That's my point," his churlish son bawled back. "A lot of girls have low self-esteem when it comes to breast size, and this kind of image is the sort of thing that contributes to unhelpful expectations. It disgusts me. I won't have it in my room. So there." Timothy stormed out and slammed the door. Gary, who had been rendered speechless by the tirade, stared at the space where his son had been. "No lasting damage, eh?" he muttered. Lasting or not, there could now be no doubt at all that books meant for girls had affected Tim's perceptions. More proactive intervention was needed if there was any hope of his growing up normal. Lynette, meanwhile, was conducting her own investigations. She was still upbraiding herself for filling her son's bedroom with Mary MacLane books, and for her own peace of mind needed to understand how she could have made such a fundamental parenting error. She was shocked to learn from a simple search of the internet that others had encountered similar problems. Indeed, far from being an isolated individual who had made a poor judgment, Lynette was simultaneously reassured and horrified to discover that she was the victim of a widespread conspiracy that had affected hundreds, perhaps thousands, maybe even millions of parents in a similar situation. "It's all part of an agenda," she breathlessly informed her husband. "The books, it's been going on for years. It's an agenda to get to the children." Gary rolled his eyes. "Of course it's an agenda," he said. Had she really only just worked this out? God, she was slow. "They are sneaking things like feminism and sexualism into our children's books in front of our eyes," Lynette continued, her face bright with alarm. "Obviously." "But how could this be happening?" she asked, bewildered. "In a civilized country, in the 21st century. I thought we were so safe and—" "The world," said Gary, "has never been so dangerous." He encircled his wife's waist with a comforting arm. "All we can do is protect ourselves from it as best we can." "But Gary, she went on, as jittery as he had ever seen her. "We can't let this happen, can we? We can't lie down and accept it. I mean, goodness, our child, the other children. We have to do something about it." "I'm doing something," he reassured her. "Don't you worry." That said, his attempts to interest Tim in any kind of sporting activity were an unmitigated disaster. As with so much else, it was not really Tim's fault. In fact, by nature he was the kind of boy who liked to please, so unwillingly though he had been dragged outdoors, he made an effort to engage with whatever one-a-side version of football his dad instigated, throwing himself as best he could into passing a ball back and forth or defending his goal, though he did this without the use of his hands, as he didn't want to get his gloves dirty. But the activity invariably ended with Tim heaving himself ever more slowly after a ball that he had no interest in catching up with, as Gary's shouted encouragement mutated into well-meaning abuse. Racket sports were a lost cause because Tim couldn't make his racket connect with any projectile he was meant to be hitting, and a rash attempt to see if he would cope on a squash court ended after a matter of minutes when Tim refused to interpret the game as anything more than an exercise in protecting his face as the ball flew at him from all directions. An endeavour to interest him in the great British tradition of cricket ended in disgrace when Gary discovered his offspring, who was supposed to be fielding, absorbed in the construction of a daisy chain. A far greater level of success was achieved at ice skating, but Gary was forced to pull the plug on the excursion when Tim, showing considerable confidence for a beginner, started doing twirls and spins like he thought he was bloody Torval and Dean. Gary took him go-karting, but whilst Tim demonstrated that he had retained everything from his cycling proficiency exam, his care and deliberation eventually meant that the other young drivers were able to lap him not once, but twice. "You don't need to signal before you manoeuvre!" Gary yelled hopelessly from the side. "I don't know that we can blame his careful driving on those books," Lynette frowned, doubting Mary MacLane's reach in spite of the horror stories she was immersing herself in online. "It's part of a pattern, though, isn't it?" "It does mean he'll be safer when he learns to drive," said Lynette, experiencing a brief, confusing feeling of gratitude towards Mary MacLane because, pretty much since Timothy's birth, she had been afflicted with an irrational fear of losing him in a car accident. "There's no point in him being safe if he's already dead inside," Gary viciously retorted. And you have to remember the go-karting experience was still raw and had been pretty soul-destroying for a lifelong fan of Formula One. "I suppose so," agreed Lynette, hurrying to her laptop to check whether there were any stories about books for girls impacting driving skills. A few days later, Gary had a brainwave. "Would you like a dog?" he asked Tim. It was a shrewd suggestion. "Oh, yes, please," gasped Tim, clapping his hands together and dancing up and down. "Don't do that," said Gary. But he had known that his son would be bound to take the bait. And, of course, once they had a big, strapping dog, it would need taking for walks, sticks thrown for it, endless, energetic games to exercise it. And as Tim's dog, that would all be Tim's responsibility, wouldn't it? Tim was grinning from ear to ear. Gary punched him playfully on the arm. He couldn't help smiling back, full of the pleasure of having simultaneously made his son happy whilst finding such an ingenious solution to their problem. "There's a dog rehoming centre not far from here. We need to decide what kind of dog we want. I was thinking a big, lively, a Yorkshire Terrier," announced Tim with determination. Gary was no expert on dogs, but that sounded ideal. The name conjured an image of northern heft and the potential to terrify. He had been planning on working through the various options with Tim, an opportunity for some father-son bonding, but decided that it was best to strike while the iron was hot, especially as Tim was usually so indecisive. He filled in the application that evening, stipulating Yorkshire Terrier in the section that asked if there was a preferred breed. Before the week was out, he took a phone call from a bubbly lady at the rehoming centre. "We have a delightful Yorkshire Terrier for adoption. Great with children. We thought you might like to come and meet him." They went to the rehoming centre, Timothy almost unable to restrain his excitement from spilling over into the kind of display that he knew would irritate his dad, and were met by a young man who introduced himself as Ralph. "I expect you want to meet your new family member," Ralph said, and Timothy had to physically hug himself to stop himself from breaking into a full-blown dance routine. They were shown to the kennels, dogs of all shapes and sizes yapping and barking around them, and found themselves in front of a chocolate-coloured pooch, its little face pushed against the wire of the door with a pleading look. "Treacle!" exclaimed Timothy, desperate to pick up the darling thing, to hug him and welcome him and take him home for cuddles. Gary stared down at the absurdly tiny animal. He took in the cartoonish face, ears sticking out from a mess of silky, drooping hair. "We asked for a Yorkshire Terrier," he told Ralph. "And, here you go." Somehow Tim was already inside the cage and had the bloody thing on his lap, nuzzling the dog with a dappy grin. "Treacle!" the boy repeated, his voice dripping with soppy affection. Gary wanted to be sick. "You're not calling it Treacle." Tim looked up, his smile faltering. "Why not?" Because we're not taking it," decided Gary. There were tears, of course. Weren't there always sodding tears? But a novelty gay dog wasn't going to solve that. What was Tim expecting, to carry the fucking thing around in a handbag? "It starts with them reading about girls," Lynette explained, "but the hidden message is, it's better to be a girl." Amazing that people fall for it. "No, but they do," Lynette insisted. "I've been talking to other mothers and they're seeing it all the time. That's why boys have started to question their identity, what they wear, who they want to be." "Tim's not asking those questions. He hasn't got the books anymore, has he?" "We don't know that. They smuggle them into schools. They put them on the shelves so our children have access without us knowing." In fact, Lynette had written a very formal letter to Timothy's school. The head had replied, assuring her that a serious conversation was happening with staff and every bookshelf in the school was being carefully vetted. She had the head's personal assurance that there wasn't a Mary MacLane book to be found in the building. She was also involved in a campaign petitioning local libraries to remove Mary MacLane's books for the sake of the children. Even so, that didn't stop them from smuggling more copies into schools and libraries, did it? "I told you I'm on it," said Gary. "Tim's fine." "Then why does he cry all the time?" "He's sulking about that bloody dog. From what you've said, I suppose we should be grateful that he doesn't want to be one." "That happens as well." Gary tried to hide his annoyance, but couldn't help feeling exasperated in his wife's lack of faith, which was supposed to be the point of marriage, wasn't it? It didn't help that Tim had resisted all of his schemes so far, as he was beginning to doubt his own effectiveness. The last thing he needed was to be undermined by his son and his wife. Apparently, one of the things to watch for is clothes and makeup going missing. When you're out, they like to dress up or put on nail varnish and lipstick. That's how it starts. Tim's not putting on makeup, snapped Gary. For God's sake, Lynette, not everything you read on those sodding websites is happening to Tim. It is unfortunate that this exchange took place on the day that Timothy had spent the afternoon at his friend Mina's house. Timothy's friendship with Mina was already something of a moot point as far as Gary was concerned. "Don't you have any real friends?" he would ask. "I have lots of friends," Timothy said, "and Mina is one of them." "No, but is she, your girlfriend?" "She is a girl and my friend." "But do you fancy her?" "I'm friends with her." Tim didn't seem to see a problem with having a non-romantic friendship with a girl. Perhaps, having read so many stories in which the protagonists were friends with girls, he hadn't thought to question whether it was normal for a boy. It was only natural for Gary to be suspicious, because what on earth did boys and girls have in common when they were 11 years old? And if they weren't doing boyfriend and girlfriend things, then what exactly were they doing? What Timothy and Mina had been doing that day was some experiments with Mina's chemistry set, and then, because the weather was good, trying out Mina's new binoculars at a nature reserve, running breathlessly from one hide to another and seeing what birds they could identify on the big lake. There were some outdoor activities that Timothy happily threw himself into of his own volition. Mina's mum had driven them there, and when they got back home, she gave them each a blackcurrant-flavoured ice lolly to cool down. The two of them walked back to Timothy's house together, chatting and laughing as they greedily licked the cool blackcurrant that dripped stickily over their hands and faces. So, in fairness to Gary, so soon after Lynette's warnings about makeup, what was he supposed to think when he saw his son and that girl walking up the front drive with rosy cheeks, pink lips, and dark streaks over their fingernails? "Inside now and clean that mess off your face!" Gary yelled from the front doorstep. Timothy, unsure why a messy face was worthy of such opprobrium, but aware enough of his dad's tone not to argue, said a hasty farewell to his friend and ran indoors. "And you can think again about any more playdates now that I know what you're up to!" Gary furiously yelled at Mina, who burst into tears and ran away. Of course, more tears, Gary thought to himself. "What happened?" Lynette asked as Gary slammed the front door. "It happened," he told her. "Makeup." Lynette's hand shot to her mouth, stifling an intake of breath. The tears welled up in her eyes. Timothy shamefacedly emerged from the bathroom, blackcurrant still smeared across his face after an over-hasty attempt to wash. "Oh, Timothy!" exclaimed his mother. He hung his head, now assuming that this was something to do with spoiling his appetite. "How could you?" "Mina's mum said I looked hot," he sadly explained. He could make no sense at all of the magnitude of his mother's distress at this, nor the lengths to which his parents subsequently went to cut off all further contact with Mina and her family. "Fucking latte-drinking liberals," Gary said to Lynette as he lay in bed that night, shaking with anger. There now being no doubt that lasting damage had been inflicted, Gary and Lynette had no recourse left to them except litigation. Fortunately, Lynette was now extremely well connected thanks to her networking, and having laid out the details of the problem, she was urged to get in touch with an independent solicitor who, she was told, was likely to work on a no-win, no-fee basis. Heather Trunk, an animated lady with aggressively spiked hair and a lot of teeth, arranged an initial online meeting with them. "This is perfect," she enthused. "A textbook case, cause and effect. There's no question that your boy has been deliberately, systematically feminized." She punched the air triumphantly. "This is the one! This is the one!" Gary and Samantha exchanged a glance. "I can't see anything to be pleased about," Gary said. "Oh, sorry for your tragedy and all that, but what's done is done. The point is, we can really go after them with this." "Who do you mean exactly?" Lynette asked, a worried look on her face. "I already wrote to the school, and there's a petition for the library. I mean, we haven't sent it yet, but—" "Pah!" said Heather, who was that rare kind of person who would actually say "pah," not just make a noise along those lines. "Forget the school, forget the library. We're going to take on Mary McLean herself." The Jenkinses exchanged another look. "Won't that be very expensive?" asked Lynette. "Surely she has lawyers on her side."
"Yeah, but I'll tell you what we have on our side," retorted Heather. "Right!"
Gary cleared his throat. "From my limited understanding, that doesn't give you the upper hand in a legal situation."
"Course it doesn't," agreed Heather, "'cause the system's a joke, totally weighted in favour of the elite. But, she hurriedly added, what you have to understand is how many people will be behind you on this, because this is not an isolated case. This is happening everywhere. Kids are being fed this diet of propaganda about girls and boys being interchangeable. They're being groomed by this elite cabal of writers and artists. It's in the music they listen to. It's written on the clothes they wear. And decent, honest people like us have had enough."
I know, agreed Lynette, excited to be in a position of knowledge for once. "I've heard about it all. The pop songs, the T-shirts, the food." "Food?" queried Gary. "It's in some of the cereals and, sweets, obviously."
"What is? Anyway," Heather hastily interrupted, "what that means is that even though we're taking on the elite, we will have the whole of the silent majority behind us."
She waved her arms as if to illustrate the scope of the groundswell of support they could expect.
"We can crowdfund this baby. We can make sure that Mary MacLane is publicly taken to task for what she has done. We can finally make sure that this whole debacle gets the publicity it deserves."
The book burnings started small. The library's petition was still open and gaining traction. But once the case of Timothy Jenkins made headlines, a few communities decided that it wasn't moving fast enough, and rather than let the poisonous agenda of Mary MacLane infect any more kids on their watch, they took matters into their own hands. In villages and smaller towns, Mary MacLane's books were dragged from the shelves of public libraries and bookshops, along with anything discerning community members identified as related material. Heather Trunk had name-checked a few offenders in various interviews, and these were removed along with any teen fiction taking its titles from kooky girl names or depicting young women on the cover, as well as, in more than one case, a weighty volume tracing the development of the French tapestry, which had the unfortunate coincidence of being authored by Marie Macklin. The books were piled up in nearby car parks and ignited, pyres symbolising the values on which those communities were prepared to take a stand. This disorder was criticised in the most vacuous terms by government spokespeople, whose feeble remonstrations over mob rule were enough to demonstrate that the widely held grievances about sexualised propaganda in children's literature were not being taken at all seriously. Naturally enough, bigger disturbances resulted, and in some areas whole libraries were razed to the ground. Fortunately, this was enough to persuade the government that communities were serious, and politicians and media alike started to acknowledge the legitimate concerns behind such incidents, and that the outbreak of arson was very much the justifiable action of concerned, law-abiding patriots. This high-profile unrest hugely benefited the crowdfunder for the case against Mary MacLane.
"We can certainly afford to run up some expenses,"
laughed Heather Trunk, and her planning meetings with Gary and Lynette began to take them to some extremely fancy restaurants, sometimes necessitating stays at equally fancy hotels. But that was fine, because it wasn't as if they couldn't afford the cost of the childminding. The lawsuit that they put together was ultimately framed as a claim for premeditated indoctrination of a young male resulting in heightened effeminacy. Gary had been pushing for some more specific terminology, but Heather explained that effeminacy was a sufficiently catch-all label to incorporate several behaviours, and the inclusion of the word heightened ought to counter any suggestion that it was a characteristic already present before MacLane's involvement. Trumpeted on social media and certain other outlets, the hearing was nevertheless a muted affair. Mindful of Timothy's age and vulnerability, the judge ordered a closed court. Mary MacLane and her advisers managed to make their arrival without anybody noticing, in spite of the circus surrounding the courtroom. Nobody quite knew how, but it has to be said that she was at an advantage, having avoided publicity for most of her career, so nobody really knew what the 58-year-old author looked like. Some suspected she had walked right through them without their knowing it, which, they rationalised, was exactly the sort of sneaky thing a depraved child corrupter would do. The Honourable Justice Whiffering had reached an age that would have long since earned him retirement in most other professions, but which was more or less seen as a badge of sagacity as a public servant in His Majesty's courts and tribunals service. He did not have children of his own, nor had he spent any time of note with children since being one himself. That was, naturally, some time ago. He was conscious that things had changed since then. Whereas most parents, even in the 21st century, would have considered a tie and jacket vital for a court appearance, Heather had advised the Jenkins family that their case would hold more weight if Timothy wore a smartish variant of his usual attire, the more colourful the better. So, certainly, the child in front of Justice Wiffering in no way resembled the easily identifiable masculinity with which he had grown up. But thanks to his regular court appointments, Justice Wiffering had his finger on the pulse of recent developments in taste and fashion, and was conscious that he would have been equally at a loss to identify modern femininity with any real clarity. Young girls frequently wore trousers in these modern times, he knew. In fact, it was as alien to him to have to accept a young boy wearing trousers when in his day shorts were absolutely de rigueur until at least the age of 13. He had studied the claim of effeminacy with dutiful fastidiousness, and knew that it was a case that required sensitive handling, clarity of judgment, and questioning of real care and discernment.
"Now then, my lad," he said, addressing Timothy, "I wonder, do you like to play with dollies?"
Timothy stared at his interlocutor. "No," he said bluntly.
"The other day he was cutting out dresses for paper dolls,"
heckled Gary, instantly apoplectic at his son's inclination towards perjury. Having warned Mr. Jenkins that calling out was contempt of court and would result in his removal if it recurred, Justice Wiffering turned back to Timothy.
"Having said that," he continued, "I would like some pellucidity over these, dresses that you were making out of paper, was it?"
"It was homework," said Timothy. "We're studying medieval society. And they weren't dresses, they were vestments." The judge's questions continued along similarly incisive lines, but after several hours, his only conclusion was that it was impossible to arrive at any certainty over the boy's proclivities one way or the other. The child was simply too young, and in an ambiguous society, whilst his attitudes and behaviour may well lean towards effeminacy, and certainly did by the standards under which he himself had been raised, in an era that was considerably more black and white in more ways than one, Timothy Jenkins might equally well be conducting himself in a way that was a normal phase for a pre-adolescent in these confusing times. After all, weren't children more or less sexless creatures anyway? Beyond the clothes they wore and the games they played, there was little to distinguish between them until such time as they became interested in the rituals of courtship. It was an astute perspective from a man who might have been assumed to be insufficiently capable of engaging with the idiosyncrasies of gender in the 21st century, and he came to a decision that was not only ingenious but which also rewrote legal precedent, provoking many column inches of fevered debate and discussion. Declaring it impossible to cast judgment either way on whether Mary MacLane could be considered responsible for substantive damage to the masculinity of a boy until he came of age, Justice Wiffering ordered a stay of court for 10 years, with the case to be reviewed after Timothy Jenkins' 21st birthday. At that point, he declared, it would be possible to cast a categorical ruling on whether MacLane's books had induced lasting muliebrity, if, and only if, they could establish sustained, unambiguous effeminacy, would damages be awarded. With that, he declared the case adjourned.
"Well, it's a win,"
declared Gary in the pub afterwards, once they had dispatched Timothy and the childminder back home.
"Isn't it? It's not a win until it's a win," retorted Heather.
Lynette nodded, not quite understanding. Thank goodness they had an expert leading them through this.
"But it's a waiting game, isn't it?" argued Gary. "In 10 years' time it'll be even more obvious what's happened to Tim. As if it's not already staring you in the face. He'll hand us damages without a second thought." "It'll almost certainly be a different judge making the decision," Heather reminded him. "And they need to see sustained, unambiguous effeminacy."
"Looks pretty unambiguous to me," muttered Gary.
"To you, yes, and you're assuming that it will be sustained."
"Are you saying you think we might not get the money?" asked Lynette, anxiously. "You don't think we have a case after all?"
Of course you have a case, Heather snapped. 10 years is a long time, is all. What do you suggest we do, then? Gary angrily snapped back. You can't do anything, said Heather. Then she turned to him slowly and met his eyes. Except let nature take its course. Timothy has been damaged by Mary MacLane. We know that. Though, now you've removed her books from his life, I suppose I wonder how obvious it's going to be to an outsider.
Gary shifted in his seat uncomfortably. His throat had suddenly gone very dry. He drained the remains of his pint and sniffed. No, he said, the boy's effeminate. The older he gets, the more it'll show.
Good,
replied Heather.
As long as you're sure.
She continued to stare at him with a meaningful look. In any case, they had largely achieved what they had set out to. The publicity around the lawsuit had brought the scandal of Mary MacLane's books into the open, and steps had been taken to ensure that vulnerable boys could not get their hands on them. Gerald Morton, the Minister for Women, Equality and Censorship, had pledged to legislate for the restriction of all female literature to women's spaces only. Whether that meant books intended for girls or all books written by women was currently up in the air, but the point was that boys would no longer have access to potentially damaging prose. By extension, in protecting writing about women from men, they were protecting women as well. Heather Trunk declared it a feminist victory, and, riding the wave of publicity, she wrote a passionate memoir about the part she had played in the battle to protect women and children. Unfortunately, there wasn't a publisher prepared to touch it, due to concerns that it would fall foul of the new legislation. Which only proved what an excellent job she had done, as Gerald Morton pointed out in the best-selling book he wrote about protecting women and children later that same year. For the Jenkins family, though, there was little closure. Gary and Lynette were trapped in a painful limbo, certain that they had been wronged, but yet to have it acknowledged or recompensed. Psychologically, that made it difficult to move on. The compensation, Gary strongly felt, was going to be especially helpful in putting the whole sorry affair behind them. They continued to be concerned about Timothy's behaviour. He had, after months of seeing little of his parents and being dragged through legal interviews and court proceedings, become even more shy and withdrawn. His conversation was sullen and monosyllabic. He barely looked at them anymore and ate little. Which was obviously a cause of great worry, though on the plus side, Gary told himself, an eating disorder was pretty unambiguously effeminate, wasn't it? One morning Gary was alarmed to see Timothy morosely kicking a football around the garden. "Stop that, Timothy! Inside, now!" he shouted out of the window. Timothy stared at him. "Why?" he asked. "There's nothing else to do. I'm not allowed to see Mina. I hate all the books on my shelf." "You could do some cooking," Gary suggested. "I'm not hungry." "Some knitting?" Timothy snorted and carried on kicking the ball, a hint of aggression in his, it has to be said, not unimpressive footwork. Gary frowned. Clearly, things could not go on like this. They put the Mary MacLane books back in his room. This turned out to be a real mission, since most existing copies had been burned and they had been deleted from any catalogues. However, through Lynette's contacts, they tracked down a group determined to preserve the legacy of Mary MacLane, who had a small supply, so they were able to get hold of the entire range before collaborating on a strategy to shut the group down through intimidation and negative publicity. They put the rest of his room back to how it had been too. Well, as best as they could, and in any case, where things weren't quite the same as before, they were definitely improvements. Gary had no idea what other paperbacks he had removed from the shelves, but bought a range of chick-lit to fill the space. Neither Gary nor Lynette could remember the names of the musicians whose pictures had adorned the walls, but they rationalised that pictures of models wearing pretty dresses would do just as well. And since they were making changes, it made sense to upgrade some of the wardrobe and furnishings at the same time. Timothy looked at the changes, nonplussed. Gary supportively patted him on the shoulder. He felt strangely calm, resigned to the loss of his son, but comforted by the thought of the car that they would be able to buy when damages were awarded. Or possibly, he thought to himself, 2 cars. He also knew how Timothy was going to react, grateful as he was bound to be, and this time he was prepared for it.
"It's okay to cry," he said. "We know this is what you wanted all along."
"Why is there a makeup table in here?" asked Timothy.
"Look in the wardrobe," said Lynette, smiling.
Timothy did. "It's full of dresses."
"They're all yours."
Timothy closed the wardrobe.
"I don't want them,"
he said, complete bafflement on his face. "I'm not interested in dresses."
"You will be,"
his dad promised. "Where are my old clothes?"
Gary put his arm around Timothy's shoulders. "It's about what you want now," he said. "What's best for you. It's about being the version of yourself that you want to be."
Timothy nodded slowly. "So can I have my old clothes back?"
"You're not a little boy anymore," said Gary. "You're a girl, and this is the kind of thing girls like. Look, nail varnish."
Timothy shrugged off his dad's arm. "Can I have my old clothes back?" he repeated. There was something about Timothy's obstinacy, thought Gary, the serious look of resolution on his face, that was almost boyish. Had his efforts to man Tim up borne fruit after all? The kid hadn't shed a single bloody tear yet. What the hell was going on? Gary's heart started to thud heavily as he saw his dreams of expensive cars evaporating. They had given the books back, hadn't they? Timothy had never really embraced masculinity when the books had been taken away, so surely he would swiftly lapse back into the outright girlishness the books had kindled before. But there was a niggling doubt at the back of his mind that he couldn't dismiss, and for the first time since the whole thing started, he felt a twinge of uncertainty that books meant for girls could have any effect at all on a boy's development. He exchanged a glance with Lynette, whose face showed similar signs of worry. Then he looked back at his ungrateful, obstinate son and made a decision. This called for proactive intervention.
"Would you like a dog?"
he asked Timothy.
"Yes,"
Timothy answered after a cautious pause.
"A Yorkshire Terrier?"
"Well," said Timothy, "perhaps a Labrador."
"A Labrador's too big. We'll get you a Yorkshire Terrier."
"If." He paused, and Timothy looked at him suspiciously, expectantly.
"If you stop complaining and wear the dresses."
Timothy looked from his dad to his mum in disbelief. Lynette nodded enthusiastically. "I'll help with the makeup," she said, "until you get used to it." None of it made sense. He didn't want to wear dresses and makeup. He was puzzled and slightly alarmed by the peculiar modelling pictures plastering his walls, and he realised he wasn't even that interested in the Mary MacLane books that seemed to be back on his shelves, less still in the other volumes which, if the titles were anything to go by, were all about shopping. It was as if he was standing in somebody else's bedroom altogether. But he did so want a dog. You have been listening to Neurotic Literature, written and performed by me, James Lark. I do hope you've enjoyed listening to this story, which was meant for girls and boys. And if it hasn't caused any lasting damage, I wonder if you'd consider supporting more stories like it. You can do that financially at ko-fi.com/neurotic literature, or if you can't feed me literally, you can feed my ego by getting in touch and telling me how much you've enjoyed this. You'll find me on Blue Sky, also on Instagram as Works of Lark. But most importantly, you can support this podcast by telling your friends, your family, your work colleagues, your pets to listen as well. Thank you so much.